Last service, the two young people ran out quickly, so when I acknowledged them, they weren't here, and I had to forgive them. Good morning, beautiful people of the center. As you heard from Evan Dow Williamson, this month's focus is on the power of forgiveness. So many people are sending me all sorts of wonderful resources about forgiveness, which I appreciate very much. Marcella Ford, one of our members, sent me a piece from the well-known photographer, author, speaker, poet David White, with just amazing words on forgiveness that he wrote quite a while ago. So I brought an extract of it here to set us going. It says, forgiveness is a heartache and difficult to achieve because, strangely, the act of forgiveness not only refuses to eliminate the original wound, but actually draws us closer to its source. To approach forgiveness is to close in on the nature of the hurt itself. The only remedy being, as we approach its raw center, to reimagine our relation to it. Just beautiful. And as I read it, I thought about last month when we talked about the power of awareness. And the author Neville, he talked about that ability we have to use our imagination to conceive of a greater yet to be. And how he said it's so important for us to accept that we can evolve, that we can change, and we can grow. And so I love that line about closing in on the nature of the hurt. The only remedy being, as we approach its raw center, to reimagine our relation to it. Because so much of forgiveness work has to do with the retelling of the story of what happened. The reframing, the reimagining. And at first, you may not know just how. That's what the lines in Christopher's song said. You may not know how. And that's the nature of forgiveness work. It's very much like unraveling a ball of yarn that my cat Andrew has tangled into a mess. It's possible, but you're going to have to be patient and take time. And the quote goes on to say, it may be that the part of us that was stuck and hurt can never forgive. And that forgiveness itself never arises from the part of us that was actually wounded. The wound itself may be the part of us incapable of forgetting and perhaps not meant to forget. Stranger still, it is that wounded, branded, unforgetting part of us that eventually makes forgiveness an act of compassion rather than one of simply forgetting. Now, many people tell me that this forgetting part, the forgetting part is the part that really trips them up. That's the part where they get stuck because they can't imagine forgetting. And personally, I've never taken the phrase forgive and forget literally. I don't think it means literally forget. I think it means something else. I think the whole phrase is pointing to something more subtle. When I was a younger man, I had a friend that I really loved very much, and one day I made a terrible blunder. You see, I was trying to be popular among a group of people that really didn't accept me. I wanted to be part of the in-group. And it was the way of things that they just didn't like my friend. And so to find favor with them, I said something at a party about him, something rather ugly. And the trouble is that he overheard it. And it really hurt him. And, you know, there are some things, they seem like you can never take them back. Once said. Now, eventually I got to apologize to him because the way of trying to be with the popular group that doesn't want you is that it runs its course in due time. You come to your senses, I think. And I eventually got to stand before him and own the fact that I cared more about being in that group than I actually cared about his feelings. And I got to apologize to him for it. It was very difficult. And he was so very kind to me. He said, "Edward, it didn't happen." Now, of course it happened. Of course I hurt him. Of course I was deeply sorry. Of course I would remember for a long time. And yet at the same time, he was being gracious. And it was a graciousness that would change me, that I would remember all my life. He was being generous with me. He taught me what forget might mean. To forget is a generosity of spirit that means I won't refer to it all the time. I won't live from it all the time. I won't treat you from it all the time. I won't judge you from it all the time. David White says, forgiveness is a skill, a way of preserving clarity, sanity, and generosity in an individual life. A beautiful question, and a way of shaping the mind to a future we want for ourselves. Shaping our minds. Understanding forgiveness and using it in life to move forward into this future that we want to see ourselves in, it's a daunting task if you're feeling betrayed or you're in the hurt. It's daunting. It's a well-known fact that exercise is good for you. It's a well-known fact that if you exercise, it acts like an antidote to depression. Everybody knows that. But try exercise when you're depressed. Similarly, it's a well-known fact that forgiveness is good for you. Everybody knows that. That forgiveness will release all kinds of trapped energy and allow it to be rechanneled into beautiful, creative areas. Everybody knows that. However, try to do forgiveness work when you're in the hurt. So it requires approaching it mindfully. And I've collected some points that have helped me in my journey of forgiveness. And maybe you've got your own points. I'll share mine with you as a way of maybe inspiring you to develop your own. Here's the first thing I think has been important for me: to be compassionate with myself. Because sometimes what gets in the way of forgiveness, people will tell me, is the pressure to forgive. Everybody knows you ought to. And that pressure could come from inside of your own self, in your own mind. It could come from your spiritual tradition. It could come from your society. Everybody knows you ought to forgive, which makes it doubly hard when you can't. Because now it's a double whammy. Not only can't you forgive, now you're a bad person because you can't. So it becomes very important to be compassionate with oneself when you're having difficulty forgiving, and to remember it's probably more normal than you realize to struggle with it. It's a headache. And yet it's like any good skill that is worth mastering, like yoga, or music, or art, or a language. There are times during the progress of practicing through it where our advancement seems to be stuck, like there's no progress at all. But something is happening in every moment of practice on the unseen side of life. Skills are being accumulated. Wisdom is being drawn in. Understanding is being blended and combined with every little bit of practice and little bit of willingness. With every step you take, you are indeed shaping your mind to a future you want for yourself and the whole world. Sometimes people who cannot forgive, they feel a tremendous sense of shame and failure. And I've spoken to some people like that, and I think that it's very important to understand that in reality, sometimes it's not your time to forgive. And it's important, I think, to know that if you and I force ourselves to do something that we are not ready to do, we can cause additional harm. When I was a young man, I so very much wanted to be a yoga teacher. I did. I wanted to be a yoga teacher before my body was ready to be a yogi. And I couldn't do forward bends just because of the way my body is structured. And that was going to be a problem for the teaching certificate, because you have to be able to demonstrate and teach from experience and know-how. It has to be a real experience. It can't just be book knowledge. So I would get into a forward bend and I'd get my friends to stand on my back. I did untold damage to my spine. It's the same if you go ahead of your pace when you're at the gym. And it's the same if you force yourself to forgive when it's not your time. And you may very well add to the problem by creating another layer of resentment to deal with. Compassion and gentleness may mean simply being willing to think about forgiveness as the first appropriate step, rather than to think constantly of being on the other side of it. Just accept thinking about it as valuable, and to try, if possible, to not put a schedule on your forgiveness. We wouldn't do that with bereavement. In this regard, forgiveness and bereavement are very similar. Everybody does it in their own way and in their own time. We wouldn't say to somebody in grief, hurry up and get over that grief. What's wrong with you? You can't be very spiritual. And we ought not to say the same things to ourselves when we seem not to be able to forgive just yet. The second point helps in this regard. For me to be clear on what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not has been very healing. It's helped me debunk some of the popular myths about what forgiveness is, and in that regard create some relief. So I collect phrases like this. I use it as a meditation. Here are some that I've collected over time, and maybe you have your own. Forgiveness is not condoning unkindness. Forgiveness is not forgetting that something painful happened. Forgiveness is not excusing poor behavior. Forgiveness does not have to be an otherworldly or religious experience. Forgiveness is not denying or minimizing your hurt. Forgiveness does not necessarily mean reconciling with the offender. Forgiveness does not mean you give up having feelings. Forgiveness does not necessarily require an announcement. I also like to collect phrases about what forgiveness is to balance it out. Forgiveness is a state of freedom. Forgiveness is relieving yourself of the burden of the past. Forgiveness is embracing the prospect of being a whole person again. Forgiveness is giving the person you forgive, and that might very well be yourself, the freedom to live in peace and the chance to also be a whole person again. And I keep on collecting phrases like this and adding to it, like from this month's book, Forgiveness, the Greatest Healer of All by Gerald Jampolsky. I've been making notes as I go along and taking phrases out like these. Forgiveness is the willingness to let go of the hurtful past. Forgiveness is the decision to no longer suffer. Forgiveness is the choice to no longer find value in hatred or anger. Forgiveness is letting go of the desire to hurt others or ourselves because of something that is already in the past. So I collect them so I can read them and repeat them and dwell in them. And in so doing, I find it is actually a way of shaping my mind to a future I want for me and for everyone. Another mindfulness practice has been to have healthy boundaries, because sometimes what stops people from forgiving is the thought that the person who they are forgiving will just go right ahead and do the same thing all over again. Which could be so. Which is why healthy boundaries, in some cases, are very important so that we can live with less fear. And I think that may require another reframe. Like, forgiveness doesn't mean letting people walk all over me. Instead, maybe it's possible to actually forgive someone and at the same time kindly choose to not hang out with them again. Which can be difficult. It might require a lot of strength, because in many cases we want to very, very much hang out with them again, and we believe that our forgiveness may change them. And in some cases that's true. Like with my friend who took the risk to forgive me, and that changed me. He took the risk to forget, and that changed me. But in some cases it's not true. And knowing the difference between when to trust and when to risk, it requires tremendous maturity and patience. Talking of forgetting, here's a good one. Forget about remorse and revenge. Don't let that be your goal for forgiveness. Sometimes what stops people from doing forgiveness work is that they have a desire in them that is stronger than forgiveness. Their desire is to get even, or a hope at least that the person being forgiven will somehow show remorse, which is sometimes literally impossible because they may have already passed on. Or you may be forgiving an abstract, something like life itself. Or you may be forgiving someone who doesn't care. Revenge is not always possible. It's always inadvisable. At best, it gives momentarily a mild relief, but followed very quickly by a sense of buyer's remorse. My message today is this, that your willingness just to consider forgiveness with me, with each other every year, is in itself a pathway to freedom. It is indeed the way we are shaping our minds to a future that we want for ourselves and for everyone. And the sheer difficulty of doing the work lessens, I believe, as we educate ourselves about what it is, what it isn't, what it might be, and what are the gentle ways we might go about doing the work. This past Wednesday evening was our first Wednesday of the month prayer, meditation, and song service with Christopher Fritchie. With me that evening was Kevin Craig and Becca Kelly, she's in the nursery right now, and Jeff Basham, I saw him earlier, and Julia Lockett, and Evan's brother, Bryce Dow Williamson. We were all together with the practitioner on duty, Jan Svoboda. And what we did was we began a practice that in Chris's song we're invited to do, and that is to let love in so that it can show us the way through the tangled wall of yarn called unforgiveness. And we did that in the style of the Buddhist meditation of loving kindness. May you be filled with loving kindness. Taking phrases that are centered on forgiveness, adapted from Ernest Holmes and from the author William Martin, and we said them over and over and over again to do that letting in of love to guide us, so that we might shape our minds to a future we want for ourselves.